They came to church for healing. Instead, they found hell in a pulpit, and by the time the truth came out, bodies were already in the ground. This is not your average crime story. Stay to the end to find out the chilling truth the church tried to bury. A congregation gathered every Sunday in their finest clothes, men in crisp suits, women in flowing dresses, children well-behaved and full of energy, filling the pews of one of Atlanta's most celebrated megachurches. The parking lot overflowed. The choir's harmonies spilled through massive speakers. Cameras panned across raised hands and tearful eyes as the congregation worshipped a God they believed in, led by a man they trusted without question. His name was Pastor Darnell Green. To the outside world, he was more than a preacher. He was a celebrity. With over 2 million followers online, guest appearances on national talk shows, and a book tour that sold out arenas, Pastor Green was seen as a modern prophet, charismatic, commanding, and untouchably powerful. His sermons lit up screens in homes across the country. His words were repeated like scripture. Women praised him. Men admired him. And the church he built stood as a testament to what faith could do. But on a rainy morning in late October, a young woman named Monique Hill was found dead in her apartment, alone, cold, and silent. A single bullet to the chest. Her Bible still open on her nightstand. Police said there were no signs of forced entry. No struggle. Just a locked door, a lifeless body, and a growing list of unanswered questions. 2 days later, her diary surfaced, and everything changed. The entries were handwritten, carefully, as though she had written them for someone to eventually find. There were no accusations, no confessions. Just details. Times. Names. Encounters. And a pattern that pointed toward a life of secrecy, one tied closely to the man who had baptized her just months before. She had written about meetings in his office, private prayer sessions that lasted for hours, and late-night phone calls that she struggled to explain to her mother. She mentioned feelings of guilt, shame, confusion. But what stood out most were the warnings. She told herself to stay away. She told herself to stop answering his messages. But she never did. She couldn't, and then, she was gone. Her death was followed by silence. Not mourning. Not outrage. Just silence, until a second woman vanished, Latrice Thomas. A mother of two. Church secretary. Known for her loyalty, admired for her devotion. She was last seen leaving the church late one evening after choir practice. Her car was discovered the next morning, engine still warm, doors unlocked. Her phone was found on the passenger seat, screen cracked, battery dead. There was no sign of her, and yet, those close to her weren't surprised. They whispered in corners. Avoided eye contact. Changed subjects when her name came up. Her best friend, in a shaky voice, said she was trying to tell the truth. She wanted to come forward. But she was scared. The question no one dared to ask out loud was finally put in writing, on a whiteboard in a detective's office. What is going on at Kingdom Grace Fellowship? It wasn't just about affairs. It wasn't just about secrets. This was bigger. Women who once sang in the choir were disappearing. Journal entries were being erased from phones. Security footage was missing, hours of footage. And the man at the center of it all, Pastor Darnell Green, kept preaching every Sunday as if nothing had happened. No one interrupted him. No one challenged him, not yet, but then, an anonymous email landed in the inbox of a local reporter. The subject line read, "They won't believe me, but maybe they'll believe this." Attached was a recording, and when it played, the entire narrative began to unravel. This is the story of how power can blind, how trust can be weaponized, and how a congregation built on faith became ground zero for one of the most chilling murder cases in modern American history, and it all began with a pastor who smiled into the camera every Sunday, while keeping deadly secrets just out of frame. Kingdom Grace Fellowship had always been a symbol of hope in a city that had seen its share of broken promises. Located just outside downtown Atlanta, the church sat atop a hill, its towering white steeple visible from blocks away. People called it a sanctuary. A place where the lost could find themselves. Where families could rebuild. Where burdens could be laid at the altar. For many, that's exactly what it was, until people started dying. The first investigation into Monique Hill's death was brief. Atlanta police marked it as a suicide within 48 hours. Her door was locked. Her keys were on the counter. No forced entry. One gunshot wound to the chest, close range. A small caliber handgun was found in her dresser, wiped clean. But Monique had no registered firearm. No training. No reason, according to her family, to ever consider ending her life. Her mother, Jacqueline Hill, was the first to push back. She told detectives her daughter was excited about starting nursing school. She had just enrolled in classes. She had just gotten her own place. She was saving money to buy a car. Jacqueline said, if anything, she was finally happy. She had been through a lot. But she was finally finding herself. When asked if Monique had any enemies or recent troubles, Jacqueline hesitated. She looked down. Then she said 4 words that caught the detective's attention. She loved that pastor. What she meant by love wasn't entirely clear. She couldn't say if it was romantic, spiritual, emotional, or something else. What she did say was this: Monique changed after she started counseling sessions with Pastor Green. She stopped calling her mother as often. She began to miss work. She started dressing differently. And one night, through tears, she told her mom, he said, I'm chosen. That I've been set apart for something holy. But I don't feel holy, Mama. I feel dirty. When investigators looked deeper, they found inconsistencies. The church's internal records didn't list Monique as having any official meetings with Pastor Green, despite her diary describing multiple private sessions in detail. There were no entries. No notes. No calendar invites, but Monique's phone, recovered from her apartment, had over 50 calls and texts from a number registered to the church. A number traced back to the pastor's private line. None of the messages were incriminating. But their timing raised eyebrows. Many were sent late at night. After midnight. Some as late as 2:30 in the morning. One text read, "Meet me at the side door. I'll explain everything." That message was sent 3 days before she died. Then came the journal. A small, leather-bound book tucked between textbooks on her shelf. The entries began 6 months earlier and chronicled what appeared to be a slow, painful unraveling. One entry read, "He touches my hand and tells me it's part of the healing. That I've been through too much to trust anyone else. I want to believe him. I want to think this is what God intended. But it doesn't feel right. It feels confusing. I want to tell someone, but who would believe me?" Another, dated just 2 weeks before her death, "He told me not to go to the police. That they wouldn't understand. That people like me get chewed up by the system. I don't know what's worse, being ignored or being destroyed." That line stayed with the detective assigned to her case. He read it out loud during an internal briefing and followed it with one question: why would a woman with no criminal record, no history of mental illness, and no registered weapon suddenly end her life after weeks of secret meetings with a man of God? They reopened the case. Meanwhile, rumors spread through the church like wildfire. People whispered during Bible study. Eyes followed the pastor in the hallway. Attendance dropped. And for the first time in years, the sanctuary was half empty. Then Latrice disappeared. Her husband reported her missing less than 12 hours after she failed to return home. He said it wasn't like her. She always called. She always checked in. She never left her kids waiting. Police found her car 2 miles from the church, parked near a construction site. The seat was pushed back, as if someone else had driven it. Her purse was missing, but her phone remained. One voicemail had been deleted. Investigators recovered it days later. The voice on the recording was low, calm, familiar. "I know you think you're doing the right thing. But there are things you don't understand. If this goes public, you won't be the only one hurt. The caller didn't identify himself. But the voice, it matched a familiar pattern. The cadence. The tone. The phrasing. It was enough for a forensic linguist to flag the voicemail. And it was enough for a judge to issue a warrant for phone records linked to Pastor Darnell Green. They found hundreds of calls. To women across the congregation. Many of them recent. Many of them deleted. Still, Pastor Green denied everything that in a press conference held outside the church. He stood behind a podium in a dark blue suit and spoke with conviction. These allegations are an attack. On me. On this church. On our community. We will pray for truth to rise and for evil to be exposed. But I want to be clear, I have never hurt anyone. I have only served. But the press wasn't convinced. And neither were the families. That's when the email came. A single file. Rough audio. No subject. No signature. The voice on the tape was unmistakable. You don't get to say no. You said you loved me. You said this was God's will. Now you want to pretend like I forced you. After everything I've given you. The recording was scratchy, clipped in parts, but clear enough to send shockwaves through the investigation. Analysts confirmed the voice belonged to Pastor Green. The woman's voice was harder to identify. But her last word was chilling. She said, "If you hurt me, they will know." Days later, her body was found in the river. Latrice Thomas had been strangled. Blunt force trauma to the head. No water in the lungs. She was dead before she hit the water. At that point, the case could no longer be contained. Multiple women came forward. Some anonymously. Some through attorneys. They spoke of manipulation. Of threats. Of promises made in prayer rooms and broken in silence, and beneath it all, a pattern of coercion. Carefully constructed. Hidden behind scriptures. Shielded by reputation, the arrest came quietly. Pastor Green was taken from his home in the early hours of the morning. No cameras. No sirens. Just 2 officers, a pair of handcuffs, and a man who refused to say a single word on the way to the station. But the silence didn't last long, because one of his closest associates, the man who managed the church's finances and security systems, agreed to talk, and what he revealed would take the case from scandal to murder conspiracy. This is just the beginning. That he was known only as Brother Cal. A quiet man in his mid-40s, tall, clean-shaven, always standing just behind the pastor, always in the background. If Pastor Green was the voice, Brother Cal was the shadow. He managed the church's finances, the security cameras, the staff rosters. He had keys to every room in the building, including the private study that no one entered without invitation. For years, he kept silent. But after days in custody, he folded that in a dimly lit interview room, with his hands trembling and his voice barely above a whisper. Brother Cal said, "There are cameras that aren't listed on any record. Private backups. Tapes that never went to the system. They were kept separately, by order of Pastor Green." When detectives asked why, he hesitated, then replied, "Because some things were never meant to be seen again." With that, the entire investigation cracked wide open. Inside a locked drawer in the church's main office, behind stacks of church donation envelopes and dusty Bibles, police recovered 2 hard drives. Password protected. Unmarked. It took cybercrime experts 2 days to get inside them. What they found would shake the investigation, and the entire city, to its core. Video footage, time-stamped, showing women entering the pastor's private study late at night. Women who were supposed to be attending counseling. Some of them minors. Others, married members of the congregation. The footage didn't show physical violence. But it captured long conversations, some arguments, and in one instance, crying. The same women who would later vanish. In one video, Monique Hill sat across from Pastor Green. Her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes locked on the floor. She whispered, "I don't want this anymore." Green leaned in. His voice sharp. "You don't get to walk away now." The files were handed to the district attorney. A grand jury was convened within days, the church went into lockdown, board members resigned. Church elders released a joint statement condemning the abuse of trust. The congregation splintered. Protesters lined the sidewalk. News vans circled like vultures. And for the first time since its opening, Kingdom Grace Fellowship canceled Sunday service, but even as the case built momentum, there were layers still untouched. Layers buried beneath public sermons, under heavy robes, inside backrooms and quiet corners of the church where no cameras reached, because the deeper detectives went, the more they found. 3 years earlier, another young woman, Maria Jenkins, had died in a supposed car accident. She had left choir rehearsal late. Her car veered off a bridge. Toxicology reported no alcohol, no drugs, no sign of foul play. It was ruled a tragic accident, until her sister contacted investigators with a letter. It was handwritten. The ink had faded. But the words were unmistakable: if anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident. I told him I was going to the police. I told him I wasn't scared. But I am. I just don't want to stay silent anymore. The letter was dated one day before her death. Maria had been listed as a spiritual mentee of Pastor Green. Her name was also found on the newly recovered hard drives. Now, her death was being reclassified as suspicious. Patterns began to emerge. Patterns of grooming, isolation, shame, control. Victims described the same tactics: being separated from their families, warned against evil influences, pulled into late-night prayer circles, made to believe that their connection to the pastor was divine, predestined, sacred. When they resisted, they were rebuked. When they threatened to expose him, they disappeared. As the charges stacked: coercion, obstruction, sexual misconduct, murder conspiracy, more names came forward. Names of women who had been silenced. Names of enablers within the church who knew and said nothing. Names of people who now feared for their own lives. The courtroom was packed when the trial began. Pastor Green entered in a navy blue suit, handcuffed, with eyes still holding the weight of years spent preaching to crowds that once adored him. But this time, there was no applause. No amen. Only silence. The prosecution opened with the audio recording from the anonymous email. Then the footage. Then the diary entries. Witness after witness took the stand: women whose voices cracked with grief, mothers holding back tears, men who admitted they ignored warning signs because they were taught never to question the man of God. One juror described the testimony as something you can't unhear. Something that wakes you up in the middle of the night. But even with all the evidence, even with the footage and the letters and the tears, the defense pushed back. They argued that the relationships were consensual. That the deaths were tragic coincidences. That the voices on the tapes were doctored. That Pastor Green was a victim of a targeted smear campaign meant to destroy black excellence, religious leadership, and a community's only safe space. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The verdict came on a Tuesday: guilty. On all counts. The judge, in delivering the sentence, said, "You used the word of God as a weapon. You turned faith into fear. You manipulated women seeking guidance, and when they resisted, you silenced them, permanently. This court finds no redemption in that." He was sentenced to life without parole. Brother Cal received 5 years for obstruction and accessory after the fact. He testified that he stayed silent out of fear, but admitted he should have spoken up. "I thought I was protecting the church," he said. "But I was only protecting a monster." The church was shut down within months. The building was boarded up, the grounds overgrown. Graffiti covered the front doors. Memorials for the victims were placed at the steps: flowers, candles, framed photos, letters from strangers, but the damage had already been done. 5 confirmed victims. 3 suspicious deaths. 2 missing women still unaccounted for, and a congregation left in pieces. To this day, some still believe Pastor Green was innocent. They say the devil attacked a man doing God's work. Others say justice wasn't enough. That a man like that should have never had a pulpit, a platform, or power. But one thing is certain: faith, once broken by the hands that were meant to protect it, is never rebuilt the same, and the echoes of Kingdom Grace Fellowship, of the secrets it held, and the lives it destroyed, still haunt those who dared to believe. The court's verdict may have closed the case in the eyes of the law, but for the families left behind, the silence that followed was louder than the courtroom gavel. Jacqueline Hill never returned to her job as a school nurse. Monique's empty room stayed untouched. The books on her desk, the graduation cap she never wore, the church bulletin folded neatly beside her lamp. All of it remained, as if she might walk through the door any day. "I didn't get justice," Jacqueline said in an interview months later. "I got a sentence for a man. But my daughter is still in the ground." She wasn't alone in that feeling. Latrice's husband, Devin Thomas, filed a civil suit against the church board, claiming negligence, willful concealment, and emotional damages. During his testimony, he held up the last birthday card his wife had written to their daughter. She said she wanted to be a better mother. That she was starting over. That everything was finally making sense. That pastor turned her around, all right, but not toward God. The lawsuit unearthed another disturbing detail: insurance claims filed by the church months after each death. Payouts were made to unnamed beneficiaries, some connected to shell organizations traced back to businesses owned by former staff members. Financial fraud, racketeering, laundering. What started as a murder trial had now exposed a web of corruption tangled in money and influence, and still, the names kept surfacing. Reporters began compiling a timeline. A pattern emerged. Nearly every woman who disappeared, died, or came forward had one thing in common: counseling sessions with Pastor Green labeled under spiritual restoration. That term was never defined. When asked about it during the trial, the assistant pastor claimed it was a broad label used for healing prayer, trauma counseling, and deliverance ministry. But investigators found it used almost exclusively for young, single women. All of them between the ages of 18 and 30. And then came the letters, over 40 handwritten testimonies, some mailed anonymously, others signed and notarized. Letters from women across 3 states. Former church members. Women who had moved away. Women who had tried to forget. The contents were consistent: unwanted advances, suggestive sermons, threats cloaked in scripture, nights spent wondering whether saying no would cost them everything. One letter read, "He said my silence was obedience. That if I questioned him, I was questioning God. I was 20. Hadn't even figured out who I was. And he convinced me I was already broken." Another woman wrote, "I didn't know I could say no. I didn't think anyone would believe me. And now that I've watched the trial, I wonder, how many of us were there?" A quiet movement began. Online forums. Anonymous survivor groups. Social media pages that posted one phrase over and over again: "I went to Kingdom Grace." And under each post, hundreds of replies. Some shared memories. Others shared grief. But all of them shared a wound that never fully healed. The church building sat empty for over a year before being sold at auction. The new owners planned to convert it into a community center, though rumors spread quickly about bad energy, lights flickering at night, and the echo of voices long gone. Construction crews rotated frequently. Some left mid-contract. One foreman told a local paper, "I don't know what it is, but that place feels like it remembers." The city tried to move on. But Kingdom Grace had been more than a church. It was an institution. To other megachurches using similar spiritual counseling programs. Several were shut down. One pastor resigned. 2 more were indicted on unrelated charges, though their methods bore striking similarities, and yet, there were still unanswered questions. 2 women remained missing: Danielle Brooks, last seen leaving a late-night revival; Alma Rodriguez, who disappeared after a prayer retreat. Their cases remain open, and in the attic of Danielle's childhood home, her sister found a journal. Torn pages. Ink stains. A final entry: "He said he could save me. But the more I talk to him, the more I feel like I'm being erased." For investigators, that was the last breadcrumb. A cold trail in a story that still haunts an entire city, because this wasn't just about one man, or one pulpit, or even one church. This was about the power we give to people who speak in God's name, the weight of their words, and the destruction they can cause when no one dares to question them. Kingdom Grace Fellowship is gone, but the echoes still remain. Months passed. Then a year, the church stood vacant, its windows boarded up and its once vibrant stained glass cracked from neglect. The paint on the steeple peeled under the weight of time and memory. No one walked past it without looking away. Some crossed the street. Others made the sign of the cross, whispering prayers under their breath, not of hope, but protection. But the story was far from over. In July of the following year, construction resumed. The new owners hired a fresh crew, promising increased security, rotating shifts, and limited nighttime work. Still, within days, a discovery stopped everything. A sub-basement that wasn't listed on any of the blueprints. There was no visible entry from inside the building. It was found only when a jackhammer tore through the floor of what had once been Pastor Green's private study. A hollow echo. Then a cavity beneath the concrete. When the construction team broke through, they uncovered a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Police were called immediately. Inside the space, barely wide enough for two people to stand shoulder to shoulder, they found a room. No windows. One light bulb. And rows of storage containers, locked metal drawers, labeled file boxes. Forensic teams were brought in. Over the course of 2 weeks, they catalogued nearly 100 individual pieces of evidence. Among them, dozens of videotapes dated as far back as 2006, detailed written logs of counseling sessions, folders with names, women, mostly, but also men, photographs taken without consent, multiple cell phones, long out of service, some still containing messages never sent, and at the very back, beneath a sheet of plastic, a suitcase. Inside it, a human skull. Dental records confirmed the worst. Danielle Brooks, the missing woman last seen at a revival, her case unsolved for over 2 years. Her remains were found in what prosecutors would later describe as an intentional tomb. It changed everything. The media storm reignited. State authorities reopened every case tied to Kingdom Grace. The FBI joined. Cold case investigators from across the country came forward. Whistleblowers, once too afraid to speak, now offered testimonies with immunity. And then, another turned out a second body, buried beneath the church parking lot. Alma Rodriguez. That she'd been missing for 3 years. The last known image of her was captured by a church security camera, one not included in the original evidence turned over by Brother Cow. This wasn't negligence. This was methodical. Both victims had been listed as uncooperative in the logs recovered from the hidden room, next to their names, in red ink, handled. The implications were catastrophic. This wasn't simply a case of abuse, or control, or religious manipulation. This was organized concealment. Intentional silencing. Murder, methodically carried out by someone who believed he could never be touched. The DA launched a second wave of indictments. 2 former board members were arrested on obstruction charges. One was caught attempting to flee the country. Another confessed to facilitating hush payments, disguised as benevolence funds, to victims' families who agreed to remain silent. Among those arrested, a retired police officer and a licensed therapist, both former members of the church's internal restoration team. Their role: to identify victims who showed signs of resistance, and report them directly to the pastor. Court records later revealed encrypted emails, burner phones, and bank transfers tied to offshore accounts. Money moved quickly. Names were protected. Evidence disappeared. It was a system, but now, the system was collapsing. Documentaries went back into production. The case became a national obsession. Netflix, HBO, and several streaming giants rushed to produce competing projects. Survivors were offered book deals. Some accepted. Others declined. A few disappeared from the public eye altogether, and for those left behind, the grief began again. Jacqueline Hill held a second memorial for Monique. This time, people came from all over the country. Victims. Former church members. Investigators. Activists. They gathered in silence beneath a gray sky. Each person was handed a candle. One by one, names were read aloud, not just Monique. Not just Danielle. Not just Alma, but the others. The unconfirmed. The nearly forgotten, names scratched out in journals, half remembered by survivors, listed in recovered ledgers with no last names. Names like Keisha L. A.M., Tina. Still waiting to be found, or confirmed, or mourned. Jacqueline, now visibly older, stood at the podium. She said only one thing: they trusted him to speak for God. But he never spoke for God. He spoke only for himself. The state of Georgia enacted new legislation that same year, requiring mandatory third-party audits for all religious counseling programs, establishing a public registry for religious leaders convicted of abuse, and opening a hotline for survivors of faith-based coercion. The law was unofficially named Monique's Voice. In prison, Pastor Green remained silent that he never appealed. Never issued a statement. Never confessed that he was moved to solitary confinement after multiple death threats from other inmates. One prison source described him as eerily calm, often seen reading his Bible aloud in his cell, his voice low, unwavering. But the world outside had changed. The church that once stood as a symbol of hope now served as a cautionary tale, and while many still struggle to understand how it all went so long unchecked, one undeniable truth remains: charisma, when left unchallenged, can become a weapon. Faith, when corrupted, can become a cage, and power, when trusted blindly, can turn a sanctuary into a hunting ground. The legacy of Kingdom Grace isn't in its sermons or songs that it lives in the silence of those who never made it out, and in the voices of those who refuse to stay silent any longer. What do you think really happened inside the walls of Kingdom Grace? Do you believe justice was truly served, or is there still more to uncover? Have you, or someone you know, ever placed faith in someone who used it for control? We want to hear from you. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, your theories, your questions, your experiences. Your voice matters, and your story might help someone else find the strength to speak up. If this case gripped you, there are more just like it: stories buried, voices silenced, truths waiting to be unearthed. Make sure to subscribe for more true crime documentaries that dig deep, ask hard questions, and shine a light where others won't. Hit the like button if this story moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, silence protects the predator, but speaking out protects the next victim. You're not alone. Keep asking. Keep watching. Keep questioning.